1,000 imperial soldiers, and he had 1,000 teams of Chinese engineers to build siege engines and flamethrowers. It was one of the largest armies the Mongols had ever put into the field. Hulagu's forces marched westwards, but not after all to Europe. They marched instead to the richest civilization not yet under their control, the Islamic Middle East. From Alamut near the Caspian Sea to the great cities of Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus, Jerusalem. Hulagu began by setting out to destroy all Muslim power bases. 3,000 miles from Mongolia, here in northern Persia, was his first target. This was the territory of the Assassins, a fanatical sect of Shia Islam, a formidable military force. They ruled from seemingly impenetrable fortresses in the mountains. The Assassins, it was said, induced new recruits with hashish-inspired visions. The word assassin comes from hashishin. With great ingenuity, the Mongols carried catapults and stone ammunition up the mountain slopes. Some of that ammunition still remains at the site. The Assassins' power was destroyed. Orthodox Muslims everywhere rejoiced at the fall of the heretics. But their joy turned to horror as Hulagu's army marched inexorably on towards the very heart of Islam. The Mongols came down through the mountains and headed toward Baghdad, the great metropolis of Islam. This was the commercial, cultural, and spiritual center of the Muslim world, home of the Caliph, sacred figurehead of the majority Sunni Muslims. It was the jewel in Islam's crown. Baghdad was one of the richest and most cultured cities the Mongols would ever capture. It was the workshop of the Muslim world, a treasure trove of science, art, commerce, and trade. The Caliph, unwisely, neither prepared his defenses nor would accept the Mongols' demand to submit. He sent his trumpeters out ahead and declared that he had soldiers enough to dry up the waves of the sea. And he contemptuously addressed Hulagu as, "O young man, scarcely entered upon your career." Hulagu was not amused, and soon after the Caliph was taken and forced to submit on bended knees. Behind him, Baghdad was destroyed. It had been a classic Mongol campaign. The enemy had resisted, and the onslaught had been ruthless. The city was surrounded, the dikes broken, the walls bombarded for days. Then the city was overrun, and the population, those that couldn't escape, slaughtered. Great buildings were burned, 5 centuries of culture destroyed. The stench of rotting flesh drove even the Mongols out of the city. The Caliph was imprisoned and then put to death, allegedly by being shut in a tower surrounded by his own treasure and then left to starve. More likely, he was wrapped in a carpet and kicked to a pulp, a Mongol way of executing royalty. The Muslim world was devastated by the fall of Baghdad. Towns and villages all over Persia and Iraq submitted to the new Mongol rulers. Sultans, emirs, and atabegs paid homage to Hulagu, bringing with them the resources and lands of the entire Mesopotamian region. With Persia and Iraq conquered, the Mongols now turned towards Syria. Their thirst for conquest seemed unquenchable. Aleppo, 500 miles from Baghdad, was the home of the senior prince of the House of Saladin. Though bravely defended from this citadel, the whole city fell to Hulagu's catapults after only 7 days. Hulagu, impressed for once by a garrison's bravery, ordered that all be spared. After Aleppo, Damascus. Panic had ridden ahead of the Mongols, as it always did. The city surrendered without a fight. A witness wrote,
"Since the birth of the Prophet, Islam has never had such sorrows to bear."
For the first time in its history, Islam was now without a religious leader, its resources plundered, and almost all its territory conquered. It seemed on the brink of extinction. But for Eastern Christians, it was a time of hopeful anticipation. They had lived under Muslim rule for some 6 centuries. The Crusaders had failed to liberate them. Now perhaps the Mongols would. This was their fervent hope. Meanwhile, there were other witnesses. With every dawn, the Crusader knights looked out from the ramparts of Crac des Chevaliers. Would the new day bring sight of the advancing Mongols? For months, they'd watched while the traditional enemy, Islam, crumbled around them. Now, the Crusaders had no idea how to respond. So the castle vaults were stocked against any eventuality. It was a time to watch and wait. It could be that Jerusalem was next along the inexorable route of the Mongols. Who knew? But it might once again be restored to the Christians. Across the Holy Land, the Eastern Christians pressed for an alliance with the Mongols. They hoped that, with Mongol help, they might regain the freedom and status taken from them by Islam. But the Crusaders, who had come from Europe, were not so sure. The problem was that no one knew what the Mongols intended. There have always been some dilemmas for which worship and prayer do not provide clear solutions. In fact, Hulagu had no specific designs on Jerusalem. To him, there were other more important goals. He had already made most of the Middle East his own empire, and now set his sights on the last remaining bastion of Islamic power in the Middle East, beyond Jerusalem. Egypt was an important Islamic power. It was controlled by the Mameluke sultans, former Turkish slaves who had seized power in 1250. After Baghdad, Cairo was the most important capital in Islam. The Mamelukes had come to power because they were easily the most formidable warriors in all the Middle East, and they had ambitions to consolidate their power in the region. They were also empire builders, and their architectural legacy in Egypt was, and still is, magnificent. As the last bastion of Islam, there was in Egypt much to protect. Indeed, the Mameluke Sultan, Qutuz, had already declared his intention of defeating the Mongols. Though the Mamelukes were numerically no match for Hulagu's armies, as soldiers they were equal to the Mongols, and they knew it. So they did not panic when envoys arrived from Hulagu carrying a familiar Mongol message.
We have already conquered a vast empire. It is for you to fly and for us to pursue. Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, and our hearts as hard as the mountains. Your walls, your fortresses will not detain us. We mean well by our warning. You are at present the only enemy against whom we must march.
But before the Mamelukes could react, news was brought from afar that dramatically changed the situation. Hulagu's brother Mungke, the great Khan, had died. So the Mongol throne was vacant, and the succession was under dispute. Hulagu's armies checked their advance and reined back, until the leadership problems in far-off Mongolia were resolved. Just as Ogadai Khan's death 20 years earlier had saved Christian Europe from a Mongol conquest, now the death of Mungke would save what remained of Islam. Some of Hulagu's huge command was quartered in areas of good pasture, but most was spread across the desert of Syria. So, while he waited for news from home, Hulagu had no option but to withdraw much of his army to the better pastures of Persia. He left behind a small garrison force to hold his Syrian frontier against the Mamelukes. The vastness of Syria was to be held by a mere 10,000 men. In Cairo, when news of the Mongol withdrawal reached the Mameluke Sultan, he ordered that Hulagu's envoys be executed and their severed heads displayed here